Thank you, Dr. Tiwari, and thanks everyone for allowing me to share some ideas with you. And it's a great privilege anytime to be in the company of Dr. Tiwari. He's a pioneer, luminary in his field, and I'm grateful to know you, sir. So first of all, I should start by saying I'm not an expert in cancer. I'm not an oncologist. I have deep interest in chronic illness, and that includes, of course, the whole area that you're an expert in and your colleagues are. My training was originally in internal medicine and then endocrinology and then neuroendocrinology. And this was at a time in the 70s when neuropeptides were first being identified. Things like opiate receptors, serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, and all the neurotransmitters that we're very familiar with right now. But in the 70s, this was a very new field, thanks to a new technology that had been developed, for which Rosalind Yalow from the VA system got the Nobel Prize, and the technology was what we call radioimmunoassay. So it was possible to measure everything that was happening for the first time in the body, and that led to the whole, ultimately to the whole explosion in molecular biology, immunotherapies, neuromodulation, epigenetics, the role of chronic inflammation and chronic disease, the connection between what was happening in our internal states of agitation, stress, or well-being. In other words, what was happening in the mind and how it correlated with the body. And at this time, I was in Boston training under a great neuroendocrinologist, Seymour Reichland, and one of our colleagues, Saul Schneider in Washington, Georgetown, had a fellow called Candice Pert, and she, in fact, was the first one to identify the opioid receptor in the brain, and she used the expression molecules of emotion. I was totally fascinated by that idea that emotional states correlated with molecules in the brain, and that, of course, now we could identify these molecules, but it turned out that there were receptors to these molecules not only in the brain but everywhere in the body. So when people looked at immune cells, particularly T cells, B cells, macrophages, there were receptors to these molecules that we thought were neuropeptides. In fact, the whole idea that they were just in the brain was dismantled. And not only were there receptors on immune cells and cardiac cells, and no matter where you looked, to these molecules of quote-unquote emotion, not only were there receptors, but the endocrine system and the immune system all actually participated in the creation of these molecules. In other words, there was traffic both ways, from the brain to the body, and from the body back to the brain. And today, of course, we have a much deeper understanding of what is called neuropsychological immune endocrine modulation, or this whole system, which ultimately is geared only for one thing, and that is homeostasis. So if you look, I mean, we're going back to medical school, the first two things we learned in physiology were homeostasis and inflammation. And the body is always bouncing between homeostasis. Ideally, homeostasis would be perfect self-regulation. And acute inflammation is also, in a way, self-regulation, because without acute inflammation, you don't recover from things like pneumonia or a bruise. But chronic inflammation identified slowly or emerged slowly as the underlying factor in almost every chronic illness. So today, if you talk to geneticists, and I've worked extensively with Rudy Tanzi at Mass General. We have written 3 books together. Rudy tells me, and again, I'm not an expert, that only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant, which means they guarantee the disease. Of course, we know in cancer, certain genes certainly almost with 90 to 100% predictability guarantee a disease. If somebody has a BRCA gene or something like that, and of course, new technologies are being explored for that, like CRISPR, and I have had the wonderful privilege of visiting these labs where it's astonishing what new technologies can do. Read the barcode of a gene as you would read the barcode of a soap or anything else at a grocery store, delete the defective gene, and insert the healthy gene. Right now, that's being done for sickle cell anemia, but it's going to emerge as a very major technology for cancer as well. So you'll be able to cut and paste genes the way you cut and paste an email. That simple. And the technologies are getting better every day. But notwithstanding that, the statistics still show that only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant. Before I came this morning, I just Googled how many gene mutations are fully penetrant in cancer, and the opinion I got from open source Google, where you can get any opinion these days, was that about 5 to maximum 10% of cancer mutations guarantee the disease. 5, maximum 10%. I called Rudy about this too because this is what he does for a living, and he says probably less than that. But let's assume it's 5 to 10%, and for that we're going to have amazing new technologies as well at a very fundamental level, at the level of gene deletion and insertion of healthy genes, and also upregulation and downregulation of genes as we understand more about metabolic pathways. Now, already those drugs are being tested in cancer, inhibitors, agonists, and neuroimmune modulators and therapies that are emerging every day. But going back to the fact that only 5 to 10% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant, so what is happening with the other genes that predispose us to disease, including cancer? Because disease is multifactorial, and you know that cancer is not one disease. It's probably hundreds of different entities with a common background, which is absence of what we call apoptosis, which is programmed cellular death. So in a way, disease, cancer particularly, is the loss of memory of death in a cell. When a cell forgets to die because it doesn't have the right self-regulation, in the absence of that memory at a molecular level, cancer is the loss of the memory of death. We recycle every day through death. Your stomach cells die every 5 days. Your skin cells die every month, so you can replenish, keep it supple, and so on. Even your skeleton recycles every 3 months. Your DNA, which presumably holds the memories of all of biological evolution, but the DNA itself, the atoms of the DNA, the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, that ultimately make up the 4 nucleotides, which ultimately create your body, the actual atoms, molecules recycle every 6 weeks in the DNA. So, our body is a very dynamic process. It's not a noun, it's a verb. And once we begin to understand that the body is a verb, in surgery, you need to treat it as a noun. Okay, with microsurgery, you start to treat it more as a molecule, or you get to the level of molecular biology. And with robotic surgery, you're using information. And ultimately, you have to understand that the body also behaves through our conscious choices every day. So this then was my journey from internal medicine to endocrinology to neuroendocrinology to today what we call not just mind-body medicine, but integrative medicine, because integrative medicine includes our entire lifestyle. And so these are the pillars of well-being that have been identified by everybody who's in the area of integrative medicine. And, not going to go in detail over all these, but it's obvious that we require 8 hours of sleep, and people who show off about not getting enough sleep are actually showing off about the wrong thing, because lack of sleep interferes with everything. It's the number one cause of premature death from cardiovascular disease. Lack of deep sleep is also the number one cause of Alzheimer's, unless you have one of the fully penetrant genes. And lack of sleep is associated with chronic inflammation in the body, which in turn is associated with over 95% of chronic illness. So I've become a fanatic about that myself, measuring sleep every day with various devices. We need 90 minutes of deep sleep, 90 minutes of dream sleep, and the remaining 5 hours is light sleep. And all these phases are equally important. You can measure the restorative effect of sleep by just looking at the amount of time you had deep sleep, light sleep, and dream sleep, but you can also look at heart rate variability and how heart rate goes below resting level in these phases of sleep. And ideally speaking, your heart rate should be going 80% of the time below your resting level when you sleep, significantly. And that spells for homeostasis. And homeostasis is self-regulation. Homeostasis is defined as a dynamic state of non-change in the midst of change. So everything has to remain within a certain range, whether it's blood sugar or metabolic activity or hormones or immune modulation. And ideally speaking, we should be in that state of homeostasis. So sleep is very important. The second area that we have identified, when I say we, people who work in this field, is meditation and stress management. And Dr. Tiwari asked me if I would share with you a process at the end of my talk for 10 minutes, and I can take you through a simple experience to give you a glimpse of what we mean by meditation, because there are many kinds of meditation: self-reflection, self-inquiry, mindfulness of perceptual activity, mindful awareness of what's happening in your body. In the yogic traditions of India, even mindful awareness of what's happening in your autonomic nervous system. And today there's a new theory that is derived from yogic traditions. It's called the polyvagal theory. And the vagus nerve, which you know is the 10th cranial nerve, interacts with all your facial nerves and trigeminal nerve and oculomotor nerve, and also with the laryngeal nerve. And then it influences heart rate variability, and then it pierces the abdomen, the diaphragm, and actually the branches of the vagal nerve innervate every visceral organ, including your prostate, of course. And not only did they innervate every visceral organ, but the parasympathetic nervous system is being understood as the system for self-regulation and therefore homeostasis and therefore what we would call healing, if we were to use that word. The world, as you know, right now is on sympathetic overdrive. Everybody's stressed about not having enough time. Everybody's stressed about deadlines, performance anxiety, publishing anxiety in academia, and on and on. But the chaos you see in the world today is basically an epidemic of stress. And stress is directly linked or indirectly linked to all the other epidemics of our time, whether it's cardiovascular disease, risk for cancer, degenerative disease. As we know, stress increases the levels of steroids in your body, and ultimately long-term steroid overstimulation, adrenaline overstimulation, noradrenaline overstimulation, inflammation obviously increases risk for disease. What was not known, which we know now, that the opposite of that, which is activating your parasympathetic nervous system, which was really part of the tradition of yoga and meditation and mindfulness and pranayama, which is breathing techniques, and even vocalization, as in chanting and deep breathing, stimulates the vagus nerve. And if you add to that what is called pratyahara, which is withdrawal of the senses, and body awareness, mindful awareness of what's happening inside your body, including the visceral organs, it's possible for you to learn, which in this part of ancient wisdom traditions, it's possible for you to learn to self-regulate your autonomic nervous system. You can slow your heart rate down consciously. I can do it in 2 minutes, my resting heart rate from 65 to 55 in less than 2 minutes. You can change your heart rate variability. You can basically target any organ in the body through yoga postures. The yoga postures are called asanas, and the word asana means seat of awareness. So every yoga posture is geared to a selective stimulation of the vagus nerve. And this is for us very exciting because we can now measure vagal stimulation, and there are new ventures now amongst pharmaceutical companies to actually figure out the metabolic pathways of these different branches of the vagus nerve and what they're doing in terms of immune modulation, endocrine modulation, etc., etc. But the polyvagal theory also shows us how to measure instantly the effects of these techniques: stress management, movement, yoga, and meditation. I'll take you through a short experience shortly to show you how that's done and what the data is also on that. Do emotions regulate our biology? Of course they do. I mean, if you're stressed, if you're angry, if you're feeling hostility, if you have guilt, depression, shame, you have a different biology than if you're experiencing love or compassion or joy or empathy. One tends to go in the direction of inflammation. Healthy emotions like love, compassion, joy, empathy take you in the direction of homeostasis. Lots of data on that and how that regulates the neuroendocrine and immune pathways. When I was in very active practice as an internist, and patients told me that they changed their diet and they went into a remission from chronic illness, I didn't believe them, honestly. I had no idea how changing somebody's diet could help them go into a remission or help their disease. Well, 30, 40 years later, we know that the majority of the genes in our body are not human genes. The majority of the genes in our body are bacterial genes. And as if you keep up with the literature, there's an explosion of understanding of the fact that only 25,000 genes are human in your body. You have approximately 2 million to 20 million bacterial genes. So technically speaking, you are a few human cells hanging on to a bacterial colony. I think we are the evolution of bacterial consciousness personally, that bacteria decided that we were a good host for them to replicate and evolve. In any case, we now know that 30% of the microbiome has disappeared in the industrialized world. 30% of the microbiome has disappeared. And that's because of industrial food production, which involves putting preservatives, which are usually petroleum products. You know, petroleum causes inflammation in the body. But also industrial food production, particularly food production involving the farming and production of animals, involves feeding animals steroids, giving them growth hormone, giving them antibiotics, and ultimately these animals are inflamed. They have inflammatory products in them. And so it has been suggested that a diet that is plant-based, that has a lot of biodiversity, genetic biodiversity, is very healthy for your microbiome. And as soon as you put food in your body, the first thing it interacts is with your bacterial genes. And if your microbiome is inflamed, then your body is going to be inflamed because the microbiome, the genes in the gut predominantly, although they're in our oral cavity, rectum, everywhere, they interact with human genes. And our metabolic activity is influenced by genes, the microbiome, and what we call epigenetics. Epigenetics means all these lifestyle factors that activate certain genes and deactivate certain other genes. Predominantly genes for self-regulation should go up, and genes for inflammation should go down. So a diet which is plant-based, which has maximum diversity, and which, if it includes meat, should have farm-to-table meat, and not come through the intervention of a factory. That would change your microbiome very quickly. I happen to be on the board, in all transparency, of some microbiome companies where we identify the microbiome, find it the right foods, probiotics, prebiotics, although probiotics, it doesn't matter how many billion you take, it's too little for you have trillions of bacteria in the gut. So either prebiotics or foods that are high in fiber, and foods that are fermented like kimchi and sauerkraut and many others will shift your microbial population, not only the activity of your genes, but the gene population itself in the direction of healing and homeostasis. So from being a total cynic about the role of diet, I have become a very enthusiastic person in everybody who has chronic illness, and looking at their microbiome, measuring their microbial activity, and looking at how changing the diet can influence the microbial activity of genes, for me, has become a passion. Finally, over here, I talk about biological rhythms. As you know, we have 4 main biological rhythms in our body. Circadian rhythms, as the earth spins on its axis. Seasonal rhythms, as the earth goes around the sun. These are very important in temperate climates like New York, for example. Gravitational rhythms, which cause the rise and fall of ocean tides. And even lunar rhythms. We are part of the symphony of the cosmos. We call it the universe, one song. And our biology is part of that behavior of the universe, which operates in rhythmicities. And anyone who has experienced jet lag knows what a disruption of this circadian rhythm is, or for physicians particularly who went through training the way we did, working all night shifts and sometimes working 48 hours on a stretch, you know what a disruption of circadian rhythm can do. And so restoring circadian rhythms has become another very important way of introducing self-regulation in the body. In fact, the Nobel Prize for Medicine 2 years ago was awarded to scientists who were able to elucidate time clocks in our body. So we have circadian clocks, we have seasonal clocks, we have gravitational clocks, we even have lunar clocks in our body. The best way to restore these rhythms is to connect with the earth. So people, veterinarians particularly, will tell you that when their pets or animals get sick, they burrow themselves in the ground till they feel better, and then they come out. And if you measure what happens when they have direct contact with the earth, it seems negative ions come from the earth into your body and neutralize the excess free radicals that build up every day as a result of just living. You know, living is not effortless. It involves a lot of work every day. And so one of the ways to decrease inflammation, and it's measurable again, is to be in direct contact with the earth. And anyone who's walked on the beach barefoot or on the grass or been in nature itself will feel rejuvenated. So some engineers, not physicians, engineers came up with the idea that if you could take a grounding wire anywhere, you know, take this chair and ground it like you would ground your computer. You know, every device, appliance has a grounding wire for basically decreasing inflammation in the room, for preventing fire. You can ground your body with an electrical wire that's connected to either a chair or a cushion or a mat or a yoga mat or even a bed sheet. And I travel with these grounding devices. They're easily available on the internet. And the effects of grounding, or earthing as it's called, are becoming popular. There's a big documentary right now on the research on earthing or grounding. And finally, in this whole scheme, I have also included self-awareness as the ultimate self-regulation. And by self-awareness means awareness of experience in the present moment, which is called mindfulness these days, but it's a complex thing. It's self-awareness includes awareness of the body, awareness of mental space, awareness of perceptual experience, awareness of the web of relationship, awareness of the ecosystem, and ultimately awareness of the fact that we are a pattern of behavior of the total universe. This has a huge tradition in wisdom traditions, as it's called Vipassana, but we call it mindfulness these days. Okay, so that's a little brief introduction to the main pillars of well-being and how they relate to every chronic illness, including cancer. Now, let me share with you a little bit of research which our foundation did in partnership with Mount Sinai and your colleagues, Dr. Tiwari, Eric Schott. So these studies included Elizabeth Blackburn, who's a Nobel laureate from UCSF, and Rudy Tanzi, who I mentioned at Mass General, Eric Schott here at Mount Sinai, Paul Mills, Sheila Patel, who are my colleagues at University of San Diego Medical School. And so this is a slide that Eric created, actually, blood-derived molecular meditation network. And Eric was able, this was his first, actually, bit of research at a course that we do in our retreat centers. And basically, what Eric looked at as molecular meditation, what he then subsequently called the molecular meditation network. And what we see in this slide is that all the genes that are responsible for increased wellness, including wound healing, platelet activation, positive regulation of heart rate, they all went up, and some went up 17-fold over baseline, which was astonishing, actually, totally. We also saw a decrease in the gene activity of diseases that were associated with susceptible, or genes activity that was associated with heart disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. And as a result of this, actually, Elizabeth, who was a Nobel Prize winner, she ended up writing a book called The Telomere Effect. Elizabeth got her Nobel Prize for discovering the enzyme telomerase, which regulates the activity of telomeres, which are those little caps or buttons at the end of our telomeres. And telomere length and telomerase activity is associated with your longevity. The longer you live, the markers are telomerase and telomere length. As we grow old, telomeres decrease in size, and ultimately, when they get to a certain length, short length, that's physical death. So in our study, there was a 40% increase in telomerase activity in those who were experienced meditators. And this is the subject of her book, The Telomere Effect. You know, when we were showing these slides first time, and somebody asked Eric, Dr. Schott, do you meditate? He said, no. And somebody else asked him, do you plan to? He said, no. He said, but you just showed us this data which you created. He said, yes, I'm going to figure out how to make drugs out of this. And actually, he's doing that right now. You know, once you know the appropriate metabolic pathway, you can make targeted drugs. So this research is not only important in understanding the role of lifestyle, it's important in the creation of future, more intelligent biomolecules that replicate pathways that are already present in our body and that have evolved literally over millions of years of evolution. You can't replicate millions of years of evolution and biosynergy through reductionist science. There's no way, because your body doesn't behave in a reductionist mode. How does a human body think thoughts, play a piano, kill germs, remove toxins, make a baby all at the same time? That's not reductionist, that's holistic. And while your body can do all of those things, it's also tracking the movement of stars and planets. It has its own biological rhythms. This intelligence of evolution cannot be replicated by a single biomolecule. Our body operates biosynergistically. Every activity in the body is correlated with every other activity in the body. So it doesn't matter what activity you're looking at in the body, it's a snapshot of every other activity in the body. So as a result of this, actually, this is all Eric's slides. He was able to create modeling for the activity of your genes. So what you're seeing in this model is actually gene activity. And you can identify this. And what Eric did very brilliantly for our group and for all our colleagues was actually say we can ultimately create predictive models to navigate between disease and well states. And this has so many implications, both for lifestyle medicine, integrative medicine, but for the role of everything I've told you: diet, stress, sleep, exercise, breathing, microbial activity. If we can start to create predictable models that navigate between disease and well states, this actually gives us a clue also how to develop future drugs, if you will, or intelligent biomolecules. So again, this is from Eric, very interesting computer modeling of how these neurotransmitters are released as our mental states change, or our emotional states change, or how if you quieten the mind and get to the level of a very quiet experience of body and mind, you're basically changing the entire architecture of genetic activity. So again, these models will be very useful for the future, because once we know where to target a network, we consider what's available to target it, and not only what can be created to target it. Okay, so again, these are different ways of saying the same thing. This is a study we published in Nature, Translational Psychiatry. This was the first study to show everything from inflammation to telomerase activity to gene activity. And this study was published in the year 2016, I believe. And since then, many other people have replicated these studies, and they've produced more or less the same results. And also, it's become clear now how epigenetics works. So epi means above, and genetics means, of course, the study of genes. And epigenetic mechanisms are basically DNA methylation and histone modification of the nucleotides in the genes, which are affected by diet, lifestyle, environment. Environment means both external environment, but also internal environment, mental environment, emotional environment. Of course, drugs and influence epigenetic activity, and so does the in utero environment and childhood. So this is an emerging field. Those blue balls that you see are histones, and what you see wrapped around those histones are genes. And actually, epigenetic mechanisms include everything from influences are everything from, as I said, environment, chemicals, drugs, aging, diet, stress, etc. And the endpoints that can be looked at include cancer, autoimmune illness, mental disorders, diabetes, and the link between these. It's very interesting that actually when you do meta-analysis of chronic illness, which we are doing through our own efforts, creating a library to look at all the data in the world right now, what comes very clear is that low-grade depression, low-grade anxiety, chronic inflammation precede chronic illness by 2 decades or so. So if somebody has Alzheimer's, it's been building up for 2 decades at least. I think it's the same true of cancer. You know, you don't get cancer overnight. It's long in the making. And therefore, you know, just like when you are, if somebody has a heart attack, you're not going to, you will give them a Lipitor, but it's not going to change things immediately, right? In the case of an acute heart attack, you need a bypass or angioplasty, and then you need everything else. But chronic disease takes a long time to build up. And the way we were trained, at least my generation was trained, if I could not find any biological marker for low-grade depression or anxiety, we used to call it functional. Okay, but now that we can precisely measure everything, including low-grade inflammation and better markers for low-grade inflammation, and soon even be able to measure. Right now, if you want to measure neural inflammation, you have to do a spinal tap. But there are new technologies that are emerging that will be able to measure every experience that we have. And ultimately, that's what our body is. It's the metabolism of experience. Everything that we experience every day is metabolized into biomolecules. And so biomolecules are the end point. They are the effect, ultimately. The body is all these things at the same time. It's matter, it's energy, it's information, and ultimately it's consciousness, at least in this paradigm. Thank you very much.